Morning. How are you?
I don't know, I'm based in Washington, I don't know
So I told you that people tend to ask me why do I walk with the kippah. I give them two reasons.
Elizabeth, do you permit that I start?
Please start.
Yeah, okay. Huh? Without her dealing with the equipment, I cannot. That's mine.
That's yours.
You deal with that also?
Oh, sorry, this one is just... Yeah, just that thing there, the red alarm.
Good morning. Wait. Good morning to everybody. Welcome. Since we last met, the European scene has slightly modified by the bombing in Madrid. And, well, it doesn't go that fast in Europe. This is, of course, a subject which I guess we will have to look at. What does it mean? How does it impact on politics? Whom will they blame? What will it do to their attitude to the Arabs? Will it have any impact on their thinking about Israel, etc.? A few remarks. The next lecture we will have, and I hope you have received all invitations, is Willy Lindwer, who we have already had here 2 times with his new movies, has a new movie on the Dutch collaboration with the Germans during the war, a subject in which the center has always been very active. This is a new movie which I think will give more publicity to an issue which in Israel has always been misinterpreted, the image of the good Dutch versus the Jews, whereas, as you all know by now, I guess, in the Netherlands the largest percentage of Jews was killed in Western Europe. Before I introduce Mr. Apostolou, I would like to make one more request. It's extremely difficult for us if you do not register before this conference, how we set up the hall. And I must say, I've looked at the list and I've looked who is present here, and there is some resemblance, but it is not dramatically major. I would really like to ask you, please, if you are, it's the only thing we ask from you. If you want to participate, please register. Well, I have for a long time been looking for somebody who could speak about anti-Semitism in Greece, because Greek anti-Semitism is very different from anti-Semitism in almost any other European country. And as nobody reads the language, it's very difficult to get a grip on it. On the one hand, Greece politicians permit themselves things which are extremely, they exist in other European countries, but they are extremely rare. You have regular anti-Semitic remarks, Holocaust-related remarks by top figures in the Greek society. In fact, the first one who compared Israel to Nazis was the Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou in 1982, and he after there had to reassure the Jewish community in Greece because of the tremendous problems it created. You have major religious anti-Semitism, you have Xenophobia in Greece. The one surprising thing which you don't have or don't have yet, I hope, with Jews. You have everything against Jews in Greece to the extreme. right-wing, left-wing, religious anti-Semitism, but the violence, fortunately enough, other than against shops or empty buildings also, against individuals hasn't been there. I'm very glad that Andrew Apostolou is willing to present us this subject on which little is known, though Greece is one of the major problems in Europe. He's the Director of Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington. He writes on Iraq, the Middle East, Central Asia. He has written on Southeastern Asia. He's worked for the Economist group. He did doctoral research at St. Antony's in Oxford, and there he has also published on Bystanders and Collaborators during the Holocaust in northern Greece. And of course, northern Greece for us means Salonika, which was the dominant Jewish community in northern Greece. So I'm very glad, Andrew, that you were willing to join us, that you're willing to give this presentation, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and also I'd like to thank somebody who's not here but who facilitated this, which is Professor Gerald Steinberg, who suggested this to me in the first place. He unfortunately couldn't make it. I hope at the end of this talk you won't turn around and say, well, he was right not to turn up.
He isn't in the country.
He isn't in the country. Well, there you have it. That's the best excuse. It's very nice to be here. I know this area of Jerusalem. I know Jerusalem relatively well, and I can tell you I've just come from Iraq, so it's very relaxing to be in Israel. So there's some good news. What I'm going to do in this talk is try and put the anti-Semitism in Greece into a sort of context that I think is important, because, as you know, for a living, I work on mostly Iraq and terrorism, and so the relationship of anti-Semitism to terrorism is very important and interesting. In recent years, there's been considerable focus on anti-Semitism in Greece because of the prominence and indeed the frequency of anti-Semitism and the crudeness, as you've just mentioned. But rather than talk about just lots of individual incidents, which are interesting in and of themselves, I'm going to look at them in the context of the Greek reaction to terrorism, and in particular September 11. And the reason is not just that September 11 was an occasion for an array of prejudices to be displayed in Greece, as elsewhere, but because, as I said, anti-Semitism is being used as either a justification or an excuse for terrorism. Now, what's interesting about Greece and anti-Semitism and September 11 is that this was actually largely missed at the time. And yet this country actually absolutely outdid itself in its reaction to what happened in the US. In no other European country was the Israeli embassy forced to issue 2 official denials of the Arab lie that Jews were warned not to go to the World Trade Center on September 11. The first reaction to September 11 in Greece was just good old-fashioned anti-Americanism, but the anti-Semitism was added in pretty soon. The Greek media are pretty venal and irresponsible, and they led the way. Greece's political leaders, for the most part, ducked and dived, and 1 or 2 brave souls tried to sound sort of sensible and moral. But even they stumbled because they were ensnared in what I would call the puerile rhetoric with which Greek politicians reach for when they're embarrassed in front of foreigners. The problem in Greece is that, and this is for both the left-wing and the right-wing press, the standard anti-American sort of nonsense that you get in something like the New Statesman or the Guardian in Britain is the mainstream. This is the standard way of looking at things. So September 11 was initially half-heartedly condemned, and then in the next breath it was justified with the usual incoherent list of supposed American crimes, more often imagined than real. And some couldn't even contain their delight at what had happened. I'll give you an example. Stathis, who's a very well-known Greek newspaper cartoonist, writing in Eleftherotypia, which is the main left-of-centre daily, wrote on September the 12th, "The moment when the USA had reached the stage of believing that it could prosecute wars both today and in the future without casualties of its own, without deaths close up," and then he put in brackets, Kosovo, "along comes David and reminds Goliath that all that is needed is 1 stone." Now, other journalists were a little bit less restrained. At Gethsemane, which is the leading daily newspaper, it's a slightly centre-right conservative newspaper, and they publish an English language edition along with the Herald Tribune every day. Journalists in one of the newsrooms were looking at the television on September 11, and they cheered when they saw the footage of the Twin Towers under attack. This story came out in an American newspaper, and Gethsemane issued a half-hearted denial. But what's interesting is that the English language edition of the paper avoided this whole story, but then notably moderated its usual rather snippy anti-Americanism, and I'm told that this was thanks to pressure from the proprietor, who was embarrassed and obviously was worried that the Herald Tribune would withdraw the co-publishing deal. Now, the Gethsemane journalists who cheered the World Trade Center attacks were actually just being true to the Greek media view of the US, which is of a mad, rampaging, bullying superpower with totalitarian proclivities. Now, according to the Greek media, the US never actually asks Greece for anything. It blackmails, it bullies, and it applies, and this is a standard phrase, asphyxiating pressure. An extreme version of this attitude was displayed during the Kosovo War when Gethsemane, again, the main newspaper in the country, called President Clinton's decision to bomb targets in downtown Belgrade a final solution. And Vradini, which is a really yellow newspaper, actually at the time ran a cartoon of Clinton as a Nazi stormtrooper crucifying peace. This was the front page. Now, the notion of the terrorists as the underdogs battling against the tyrant is rather popular in Greece, as you can tell. That's because the Greek government itself has taken a very indulgent attitude towards terrorism, either through outright support and sponsorship of terrorism, whether EOKA in Cyprus or the PKK in Turkey, or by actually allowing terrorist suspects to walk free. And that happened, I think it was the late 1980s. There was a Palestinian chap who...
Sure, the Court of Justice
Yeah.
condemned him, and then the Minister of Foreign Affairs sent him to Libya. That was the terrorist who killed the children at the synagogue in Rome.
Right. So this is the, and this is a decision that, is widely accepted as correct in Greece. Now, in 2003, that favourable view of terrorism was taking some rather gruesome lengths. I'm sure you may have seen this story by a Greek artist who produced a so-called work of art, which was a knitted suicide vest for a female suicide bomber. Now, the Greek media are actually held in rather low public esteem if you look at the opinion polls. But the odd thing is that they do have an effect. To give you an example, polls showed that 86% of Greeks opposed a US military response to September 11. Put otherwise, when the terrorists attacked the Americans, that's regrettable, but the Americans had it coming. When the Americans strike back at the terrorists, well, that's an act of aggression. And for those of you who are in the field of writing, you'll know that it's the same with intellectuals. When you criticise Susan Sontag, that's censorship, but when she tells the rest of us that we're idiots, that's freedom of speech. So strong was the anti-American current in Greece, and here again I have some good news, that there was actually more support for US military action in response to September 11 among Palestinians than among Greeks. According to opinion polls taken after September 11, but before the first military action in Afghanistan in October 2001, only 6% of Greeks, 6%, backed a US military response. The figure fell to 1% if there were going to be any civilian casualties. For comparison, 7% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza apparently said that a US military response to September 11 was justified. So there is at least some good news. The Greek media loves these sorts of polls, and in fact, in the Kosovo War, they greatly enjoyed publishing a poll that claimed that 99%, a sort of Brezhnevite figure, of Greeks were against the war in Kosovo. But the Greek Foreign Ministry finds them rather embarrassing, and under George Papandreou there was a policy of discouraging these polls and their publication. And I think that policy, you will find, will continue under the newly elected New Democracy government. Another interesting poll was taken, I think it was in December 2001, and it showed a majority of Greeks were despondent in response to the defeat of the Taliban, which is obviously not a figure you would find in Afghanistan. And now, even more remarkable is the widely voiced complaint in Greece that the US is too pro-Muslim. The US interventions to help Muslims in Bosnia and Kosovo, they may have been late, they may have been too little in many ways, but they were extremely unpopular in Greece. Prejudice against the Muslim populations of the Balkans, the historical remnants of the Ottoman Empire, runs very deep. Now, basic logic might force a person, like a Greek journalist, to ask themselves how it could possibly be that the US is hated in Greece for being too pro-Muslim, but it is disliked rather a lot in, say, Pakistan and the Arab world for being anti-Muslim. Might strike you as inconsistent, but then, if you're a Greek journalist, there's an easy way out, and the easy way out, of course, has been anti-Semitism. And that's how they knit all this together. Greek journalists have the logical skills of Noam Chomsky and the critical faculties of the late Edward Said, and these are two men who are lionised in Greece in the mainstream media. What they say is taken very, very seriously. And so they apply the standard left-wing approach of cui bono, who benefits, to staple together this conspiracy theory. From a Greek perspective, the obvious beneficiary of the Kosovo War was Turkey, Greece's historic enemy. After all, the Muslim minorities in the Balkans received political support from Turkey and a historic legacy of the Ottoman Empire. So far, so what, but the unpleasant fact is that actually, while some of you who follow the region know that Turkish public opinion supported the Kosovo War, the Turkish establishment was actually very uneasy with legitimising the whole concept of humanitarian intervention. Now, if Turkey in the Greek imagination benefited from the defeat of murderous Serb nationalism, so therefore must Turkey's ally Israel. According to this tortured thought process, the US is anti-Serb and pro-Muslim in the Balkans because it benefits Israel, but in the Middle East it's anti-Muslim because also that benefits Israel, supposedly. Now, at this point, for the anti-Semites in Greece, Turkey tends to drop out of the equation and is dismissed simply as an Israeli lackey. And again, there's a sort of willful inability to understand what's really going on in this part of the world. A good example is the 1997 Israeli-Turkish Defense Pact, which, as you know, just sealed an arrangement that had been going for some decades. It's been made very clear to the Greek government on repeated occasions, but the Greek foreign minister at the time, Theodore Pangalos, wouldn't listen, that this had actually nothing to do with Greece. You can imagine, I think the Israeli government is not too worried about what happens in Greece. I mean, Israeli nightclubbers might care about what happens in the Aegean. I don't think the Chief of Staff does. And there are some rather obvious common security concerns that Israel and Turkey might have in the Middle East, but which you might want to ignore if you're a Greek journalist or a Greek foreign minister. So how is it that, again, how does it work? How does this thought process go through? How do they explain this? Well, naturally, and it doesn't take too long to find this, why is the US doing Israel's work? Well, of course, it's the Jewish lobby. Now, don't misunderstand. Greeks don't have a problem with lobbying per se, but the problem is they have a severe case of lobby envy. The Greek government has spent rather large sums on its own lobby in the US, a rather ineffective cacophony of diaspora organisations. What bothers them, it would appear, is that supposedly somebody else is running the US foreign policy, and it's not them. Unsurprisingly, then, the basest anti-Semitic slurs from the Middle East circulate with ease in Greece. It's not surprising, therefore, that according to one opinion poll taken by Kappa Research on October the 17th and 18th, 2001, an astonishing 42% of Greeks believed that 4,000 Jews were warned in advance of the World Trade Center attacks. The analogous figure in Pakistan was 48%. Now, in a very rare gesture of principle, Erythrotypia, the newspaper in which Stathis published his comparison of David and Goliath on September the 12th, actually denounced these reports, which appeared in the Greek press and on some Greek TV channels. One member of the Greek parliament, Yorgos Karatsaferis, who's an extreme right-winger who was thrown out of New Democracy for alleging that the head of New Democracy and the press spokesman were having an affair. They are both gentlemen, which made the allegation of the affair even more controversial in Greece. He actually raised this on the floor of the Greek parliament. Karatsaferis is an extreme right-winger who's since formed a nationalist party that has its own TV channel. He's very anti-Semitic. And another thing he raised in the Greek parliament, and again, it's remarkable, he raised it, nothing happened. He said that the daughter of the previous Prime Minister, Kostas Simitis, had a secret marriage in a synagogue. And the Greek government response was, this allegation is unfounded, as opposed to, you are off your trolley. I mean, what's remarkable about the way they express their criticism is they say things like, well, these are unfounded allegations, which, as if it's to be taken seriously. Now, few overseas would have noted the outbreak of anti-Semitism following September 11 had it not been, oddly enough, for sports journalists. There was a football match on September the 20th, 2001, and some supporters of Ajax, an Athenian team, jeered during the minute's silence for the victims of September 11 and shouted, "Americans, killers." Other fans burnt an Israeli flag and attempted to burn the stars and stripes, but were unfortunate to find out that they had one of the non-inflammable variety. There's actually a picture on a website of this guy trying to burn this thing. The story appeared on ESPN and in the Washington Post. The Greek government only denounced this a week later after there was a substantial outcry overseas from Greek Americans. Eventually, the Ajax team went to the US Embassy in Athens on the 3rd of October 2001 to apologise on behalf of their fans, sign the Book of Condolences. But this was actually partly to avoid disciplinary action from UEFA, the European Footballing Authority. There was no apology to the Israeli embassy, and the anti-Israeli aspect of the incident was actually ignored by reports in The Guardian and on the BBC. And they were the only two other European media channels that I can tell actually covered the story. Now, the ease with which anti-Semitism finds expression in Greece stems from the social acceptability of prejudice. In fact, I would advise any Americans here who believe that there's a surfeit of political correctness at home to export some of the surplus to Greece. This, after all, is a country where small ads for rentals explicitly say, you may have seen this when you were there, no foreigners. Xenophobia in Greece is influenced by the Ottoman past. Again, the main focus of xenophobia is the hundreds of thousands of Albanian migrant workers. They're the most numerous migrant group in the country. There is less prejudice towards Polish migrant workers, nor indeed towards Arab immigrants. While Greeks do not accept the massive immigration into Greece since 1990 and its effect of making the country multicultural, they do not actually regard themselves in opinion polls as racist. There was an opinion poll in 1998, some of you may recall actually at the time of the World Cup, in which a large number of French admitted that they had racist beliefs. Greece got a very low score on that. People just don't believe that they're racist. And there's little xenophobic or anti-Semitic violence, as you mentioned. It's as if Greeks distinguish between a near abroad and a far abroad. This is a concept those of you who dealt with the former Soviet Union will know about. You know, countries that were part of the former Soviet Union are considered by Russians to be near abroad and others as far abroad. So near abroad minorities are detested. Far abroad minorities are regarded with a degree of indifference. What's interesting in Greece, though, is that the immigrants are now around 10% of the population, and that's something that's happened in the last 14 years. And the country's minorities are only 2%, not even. The problem with anti-Semitism, I'd say, is less that it's rampant. I mean, it's certainly there in large quantities. But it's that there's never a response. It's a very one-sided battle. It's just anti-Semitism and there's no response. It's viewed mostly with indifference, and it's considered to be a Jewish issue. When the Archbishop of Athens and all Greece, Christodolos, blamed Jews for wanting to take religion off the identity card, he was mildly mocked by Gathy Merini and obliquely criticised by the government. Again, these allegations are unfounded, this sort of thing. Rather than actually take on the issue, the problem is Greek politicians don't understand it and always wait to see if there's a reaction abroad before they'll actually say something. They don't understand that it's not going to be defeated by Jewish organisations abroad writing a letter to the Prime Minister. That's frankly irrelevant. What's going to matter is when Greek Christians say to each other that it's unacceptable. And this constant focus on how is it being seen abroad, what's our image abroad, is one of the reasons why it took until 1997 for the government to actually put up a Holocaust memorial in Salonika, and that was only because the city was the European City of Culture that year, and if they hadn't done it, again, they'd have been embarrassed. And I'll give you an example. Last December, I was asked by a chap who's an advisor to George Papandreou, what can we do about anti-Semitism? I said, take it seriously. Regard it as an issue for your country, not as an issue for your image. That's the problem. And of course, nothing happened. The unwillingness to denounce anti-Semitism, I think, is of a piece with the feeble response to terrorism, and this is where the two fit together. Again, it's a problem for complaining foreigners. It's not really a problem for Greece, as their view. And it took the recent Madrid attacks to convince the Greek government, the incoming New Democracy government, that they actually might need some international support for security for the Olympics, and they've actually asked, amazingly, for NATO support. This is one of the worst members of NATO, now they're asking for NATO support. The domestic terrorist threat in Greece was not substantial. Again, the problem was the lack of a state response. And it was remarkable that for over 25 years there wasn't a single arrest. There were only arrests after terrorists proved themselves to be more incompetent than the Greek police. And Savas Xiros of November 17 blew himself up with his own bomb, but didn't even manage to kill himself with his own bomb. He survived, and then he spilt the beans on his comrades. Given this record of incompetence and indifference to terrorist violence, it's perfectly consistent with the government to basically take